welcome everybody to what is, I almost say this with a lump in my throat, the last Tortoise think-in of COP26, but I'm already hoping that we'll be in Cairo next year. I want to thank the New York Times for this amazing space, ROCKWOOL for partnering with us for this session, and the Scottish wool industry for my personal insulation today. The session is headlined, How Do We Kickstart the Renovation Revolution? Well, the context is we've got about 36 hours to go of negotiations. They could drag on, even though Boris Johnson has made it clear he doesn't want them to, but I suspect they will. And there's some hope brewing, I think, over in the blue zone. There was a joint Chinese-American declaration last night, which I think may have engendered some hope also for progress on Article 6, which may or may not lead to a big new private sector harmonized global carbon trading system. But one thing we do know on Net Zero Cities Day, which is formally what today is that cutting emissions from the built environment that we live in, that we work in, is absolutely critical to getting the job done. So you've seen some of the sort of headline numbers. The construction sector overall accounts for, and you guys will correct me if I'm wrong, 38% of emissions, of which 20% directly from buildings. So I hope that over the course of the next hour we can talk in detail. I feel that if we can't talk about the nitty-gritty at COP, then we never will, about how to bring that number down. I've written an absurd pun here, so we'll talk about it in concrete terms, and maybe alternatives to concrete too. There's a reason for that, which is that we had a conversation earlier in the week with someone from what used to be Lafarge and is now Lafarge Holcim, and I was unable to drill down on what the real low-carbon alternatives to concrete are. Anyway, we have some great guests who I will introduce as we come to them, a real wealth of expertise. But first, for anybody who hasn't been to a think-in before, we like to say this is not your typical panel discussion, even though we're up on a stage here. The whole point is we want to hear from everybody, online, in the room. By all means, ask questions, but we actually prefer you simply to say what's on your mind, to share your points of view, your expertise. Believe me, if a response is required, we'll get a response, but we just hear from many more people and get a more honed point of view, I think, by the end, if you just say what's on your mind. And do start right away. We're not leaving Q&A until the end. That's not how this works. If we did, then everyone would realize with 5 minutes to go that they wanted to say something and there wouldn't be time. Enough housekeeping. Let me start then with Jens Birgersson, President and CEO of ROCKWOOL. Clearly as a company, Jens, you know, you've got skin in the game here, but you've also got tremendous expertise. I want to ask the most general question first. From what you've observed of the process over the last 2 weeks and you know, your sort of close observance of aspects of it that apply to you, are we still aligned with 1.5?
So first of all, I've subconsciously dropped the suit today and took a sweater and a Scottish cashmere, so that's very happy with that. No, if you look at it from a business perspective and drop words that like optimism and pessimism. If you have a meeting here, everyone is optimistic and they talk about hope. And if I just take my business glasses on and what we are used to, and I look at what's happening, I see this pledge game. I see this long discussions about 2050, and I see this motivational talks about that you do it for the grandchildren and all the rest. And in business, we are a little bit more used to bring it back. We talk about that and then we bring it back to goals the next 3 years. We try to link real accountability with results. So when I look at it, if this was our company, the whole thing, and we ran it, I would say my assessment or assumption would be that we are on track for 3 degrees C. Yeah. So when I look at it, because I see very little discussion on evaluation, what happened since the last COP. I see very little about what are we going to do the next 3 years. I see very little what we work sometimes with quarters, we're a long-term company, but at least what's going to happen now, and what are the goals, and who are going to do it, and specifically, and if they fail, are they accountable? And I'm missing that. So therefore, instead of 1.5, I would guess 3 if I judge the actions.
Well, that's pretty depressing, but I guess kind of important to hear now. I wish we could broadcast it to the blue zone. Let's focus slightly then on the sector. How urgent? Describe the nature of the problem as you see it, and your solution.
From me again?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think in the building sector, with a third of the emissions, more in the US and also more in Europe, I think the technologies are there. I think EU-wide policies there, money is there, technology is definitely there, and we have done a poll of 14,000 people in 7 countries. People want it if they get technical help. So I think actually all of it is possible to do, but it's around getting around of doing it and solving some issues. And I'm sure you run into constraints, but you've seen some countries, you know, Seattle, New York, California, Boston. In Europe, you see Italy. Italy fundamentally in 2 weeks with the scheme went from very little deep energy renovation to hyperactivity. So it can be done. So I'm very optimistic about that side. It needs to be done, and I would say it is a CO2 reduction natural resource we have, because we know how to do it, we just need to start mining it.
And how did Italy do it?
Italy did it with a scheme called Super Bonus, where they demanded deep renovation, so 2 energy steps, or roughly 60% improvement in energy efficiency in the house. And then they went in with a scheme that works for contractor, with technical assistance and quite easy to get the money, and it turned very cheap. And why they did it was that they wanted economic stimulus across the whole country. They wanted to get the contractor started, and they wanted to reach the climate goal, and they got the health benefit, the nice homes, and the social equality and the energy poverty. Address all of that, but it just accelerated. So I've seen it done, and it's fantastic when you see it.
That's really interesting. Right, I want to come, Tracy, to you in 1 second, but like a really great journalist, my pen has run out. I don't have another one. So Gurjinder, thank you so much. Oh no, but that's a pencil. What I'd really like is a biro if anyone's got one. Anyway, but that, I'll use the pencil in the meantime. Tracy Pierce, Chief Customer Officer for Homes at Santander. We've just heard Jens describe, fantastic, nice Bic, thank you so much. More Scandinavian design? No, it isn't actually. Anyway, describe a governmental response to this problem of large-scale renovation of housing stock. You have responsibility for a large chunk of the UK mortgage market, in a sense. I might be over-egging it slightly, but to what extent do you see this renovation challenge as an owners/tenants problem at the moment in the UK, given current sort of regulations, and should it be made more of a government regulation problem?
It's a great question. I think it comes to all of us from society, apart from anything else. So at a very basic level, probably around half of homeowners in the UK don't even know that their boiler is adding to the climate change challenges that we have. So with that in mind, for me, it starts with a very strong piece around consumer education. So that I guess is the first thing. I think secondly, the amount of, I think something like 21 million homes in the UK need some sort of retrofit in order to make them more energy efficient. And in order to be able to support that within the timescales that we're talking around, we need some infrastructure investment in the UK for sure to make that happen. So I think we need to be doing something like around 500,000 heat boiler replacement installations a year. Last year we did about 40,000. So that just gives you a sort of sense and size of the scale. And then we move on to the cost, and depending on which one of the articles that you read, probably something around £10,000 for those properties that need the retrofit. And guess what? Quite a lot of those properties are either owned or tenanted by those perhaps less able to be able to afford that investment. And that's assuming they understand why they're investing it. So the reality is we have many people facing not insignificant investment to retrofit their property, or an energy bill which is £250, £300 a year higher than perhaps it would be, but that cost is spread over 12 months and becomes much more affordable. So we've got the education piece needs to be there, you know, at a very detailed level. We need some infrastructure in and around how we're going to make all this retrofit happen in the right timescales. And I think some advice in terms of where you should be putting your money as a homeowner if you're going to make some of these changes to improve. So we've got those bits. And then I think we come across into policy. So even something as simple as we've got 500,000 listed houses here in the UK, and those of you that love and live in and around them, they're really difficult to get some things done. It's not impossible, but simple as double glazing, you have to apply for permission to do that. And when we talk about 500,000 listed buildings, that's a building, so there could be many doors within it, so it could be flats or, you know, something like that. So you're probably talking about 1 million people in those sorts of properties. So we need to be thinking as an industry how we're going to give those people access to be able to do a bit more in there as well.
That is so interesting, and because it's so timely, George, your punishment for writing in the chat, George Curtis, it'd be great to come to you to hear a bit more about your 17th century cottage. If you don't want to, that's fine. Can we come to George?
Yeah,
George, hello.
Myself.
This is the wonder of technology. So you've written in the chat about your 17th century cottage. Tell us about the challenges to making it energy efficient.
I thought I'd try and get solar panels put on the roof, and I'm told that I can probably get them if they can't be seen from the road. Unfortunately, my south-facing roof is facing the road, so that hasn't been allowed. I'm in touch with a group called Cosy Homes Oxfordshire, who sent me a report which I think is about £70,000 of work suggested, of which 50 was insulation. And this again is inside insulation of walls, which of course already have kitchen cabinets bolted to them. And of course, the heating problem is put in a ground source heat pump. But that will mean I need new radiators throughout the house, because at the moment the technology is not there to get the water hot enough. So all of these, I'm going to go ahead with some of this, and I've actually got some listed building experts coming to me. So I'm just hoping that over the next couple of years, I'm going to be able to kickstart this. And I'm in the local environment group, and I want to make a bit of a case study of it. I'll sign off.
George, just one more question. Any offer of financial help with the 70 grand from either local or national government?
I haven't found a way of applying for that yet.
Interesting. Well, there we go. Proves your point exactly about the listed and old and drafty buildings that many of us live in. Two quick follow-up. Well, one quick follow-up question. The gulf between the £10,000 average cost of a retrofit and that £250 to £300 extra heating bill if you don't do it. How does your industry amortise the £10,000 cost to make it lower per month than the extra heating cost?
So we're making an assumption there that it's the banking industry that needs to solve for this on its own. We are anticipating governmental support for those that are fuel poor, for sure. It would effectively be a mortgage. Green mortgages in the industry are typically slightly cheaper than you would have for a standard mortgage, but that requires you to be spending that money and those investments on retrofitting your property. Notwithstanding that, you are still talking for those that need to borrow against it being able to afford to. And let's not forget, it's not just about homeowners, it's also about tenants. And if the landlord were to pay for the retrofit and then needed to increase the rent as a result of it, can the people who are occupying those properties then just afford the higher rents? So there is that issue as well. And so I think it really falls to all of us to do what we can to try and help, initially around the education, then about which are the right aspects within your property to be retrofitting, where do you best spend your money, and then how do we get the money? So is it a combination of banks through the mortgage? Is it some government incentives and all those other things as well? There's one other thing that I think is just really important that everyone understands. So we think that banks and mortgages are the answer to some of this funding, but let us not forget something like 60% of the houses in the UK are owned outright. So there is no mortgage on them. They are unencumbered. So how do we get to those people to help them understand the impact that this has on the climate without it being through a mortgage?
And you were saying just before that you've had experience of selling green mortgages. Just very briefly, tell us how that went.
So many, many years ago, the first green mortgages were launched in the UK 10, 12 years ago, something like that. And we sold 3 in the first year. And that's not with the firm that I work for currently, but that was as an industry. And again, it's consumer education. People don't know what they're for, don't know why they want them, don't know how best to spend the money when they get it. So the consumer education piece is absolutely key. And
that's not, to be clear, 3 products, that's 3 individual mortgages. Is that changing?
Yes, it is, yeah, for sure. People are much more aware, much more banks and building societies are making these products available now, definitely. And I think people are actively and proactively looking to understand how they can better protect themselves and retrofit their properties. But it's not enough. We need to be doing more. We need to be doing it more quickly.
Thanks. Well, now, this sort of division of labour between government and finance is key. And Jens, in a minute, I want to come back to you because I know that there's a particular point, like a policy point, that you want to make about money being earmarked but not yet mobilised. But first, let me come to Jennifer Layke from the World Resources Institute. Jennifer, you are the Global Director of the Energy Programme at the World Resources Institute. And I want to ask you to help us take a step back, look at the whole sector in the round. And we've been focusing, in a sense, on problems that originate with old, drafty housing stock in a country like this. It's absolutely sort of germane to people like George in 17th century cottages, but also all housing all over this country, including mine, where my only draft excluder is a dog at the front door. But we are also heading into a new technological age where a revolution in materials as well as renovation creates tremendous opportunities, or am I overstating it?
Well, I think we've already heard there are tremendous opportunities up and down the value chain in the built environment. And I think there are a couple of things that are worth bearing in mind. So at World Resources Institute, we've been running a program with funding through the Global Environment Facility for about 6 years, focused on building efficiency activities in cities. So we have a network of 55 cities. And in that context, we've seen politically how these conversations play out at the local level. Certainly awareness issues, certainly questions around permitting and the capacity building to do permitting against code, even where there is an energy efficiency code. But there are a couple of things that I would say with regards to where we've come in that period of time. First, that we really do see important recognition that we're building the same way we've been building for 30 years with minor mechanical changes in the way we do things, or when code requires that we do something different, a little bit different R value in our insulation, or U value in insulation, things, R value in our windows, things like that. So that's incremental change. What we're talking about needing to, in the developing world, where much of my work is, we're talking about needing to think about 50% more buildings in any given city over the course of that city's expansion. And in tackling those questions, we actually have to take a much broader view than building efficiency exclusively. We need to think about the materials, the embedded carbon in what we're putting in. We need to think about passive design solutions. We need to be building for the adaptation and resiliency requirements that we're going to have over this next 50 years. And then we also need to think quickly about the social equity questions, things we've talked about already. How do you make sure that a homeowner or a business can afford to have that technology that they need in that building at the right technology level for efficiency? So there are a couple of ways that we've seen interventions work. And one that I think we haven't spoken about is around the role of the utility and its customer base. Customer-based or utility-based programs with customers in the United States anyway have been one of the primary leading ways of getting energy efficiency implementation done. I myself just did this with my own home. My utility was offering a program, energy audit plus recommendations, and then there are in many states, not in mine, utility-based financing. So there can be a relationship between a financial institution and a utility. The utility you pay on a monthly basis, and there is a way to make sure that you're actually thinking about the energy investments in your home as you're thinking about paying your utility
And
bill.
that finances actual renovations in your home?
It does, it can, yes. In fact, it can be for equipment, it can be for other types of, it can be sometimes for solar installation. It depends on in the United States context, it depends on the legislative requirements. But utilities are not incentivized today to be putting those kinds of programs together. So when we talk about the utility of the future, we have to think about changing the business model to be services oriented, not to be kilowatt hours oriented, because it's not in their best interest if they're making a return based on their kilowatt hours sold.
I just want to be clear what the sell is on that, because, and Tracy, I'd be interested to know if you know whether we have any of that utility-based renovation options for homeowners or tenants here. But in the States, does a flyer come through the door, and or you get an email from the gas company, and what do they say? If you pay X% more per month, we will help you insulate your home. How does it? What's the sell?
It starts with it. Well, there are programs available to help you finance upgrades in your home. That's something that almost any consumer is interested in. What do? I hate my drafty windows. How do I get better windows?
Right.
So most of this is outreach from the utility. They will come, they will do the audit, they will help you with, they contract out a firm, right? It's an energy service company. And then the consumer is given that data, that information, and for those jurisdictions that have utility-based programming, the rebates are all wrapped in to the package of the financing you get. So there may be manufacturer rebates, there may be city or state programs or rebates. There's a whole package that's put together and presented to the consumer. We haven't seen the consumer uptake on that, and largely it's because the transaction costs still feel high. Even if you could say, okay, well, this has a 7-year payback, right? That was what my home, the payback was 7 years. I'm going to be in this home 7 years. I'd be more comfortable living in this home for these 7 years. But then you still have to go through, get the contractor, find the day, know that the work was performed adequately. Was it performed adequately? Was it not performed adequately? Is the savings what you expected? There's a lot of cynicism about the whole transaction. So the more we can do to create a streamlined consumer experience and give them something that they feel has value, which is not just energy savings, but comfort, and a higher property value, that's going to help.
So clearly we're hearing a lot about the importance of consumer awareness, consumer education. But Jens, is there, I mean, if you can talk about the UK specifically or other markets that you operate in, is there an obvious regulatory fix that is not being used at the moment?
Very few obvious aspects here, but just to comment a little bit on what has been said. A friend of mine has a 350-year-old cottage in Scotland, and we did it, and it was very difficult. We sorted it out at the end, but when you look at the effort and the type of engineering we did, it's all classical material that fits with the stone and wood cottage. But one should also try to divide and conquer the task. You talked about 1 million protected homes or classified or cultural homes. I think what really matters is that you go with deep renovation when you go, and you can start with the easy homes first. You don't need to start with the most difficult one, because today the deep renovation is at the pace of every 500th year. So we're going to have work a long time, even if we multiply that rate with 10 or 20. So you can start where it actually works. Then what you mentioned is very, very important that it's made easy, because getting the money but then seeing a project that is difficult and scattered and not out of one hand, there need to be a simple supply of this. That needs to be sorted out and has to happen, otherwise it's just too complex. And then in terms of money, I think when you get into the payback, now we see gas prices in Europe, they've gone up 200, double, more than double, electricity too. Then of course you have a payback, but the cost of inaction here, we can't meet the climate goals without dealing with this 75% of the buildings that we have today that are inefficient. You can't meet the goal, is a fact. And therefore I think you need to step in from government and make it much more attractive. That's what they did in Italy. Instead of doing subsidized packages to build roads and restart the economy after COVID-19, they decided to go after energy efficiency, and they get a lot of social impact and health impact of that, but it's highly subsidized.
Right.
And I think that if you go with this scheme, that you had a 7-year payback, it might be 12-year payback. If you take the climate and the social and the health factor of that, the payback is much quicker. So I think government has to step in. If we are slow on it now, if we are very slow on it, I've no doubt when we're getting up in real global warming and you start to see the social unrest that causes, then all those other factors will scale up in multitude, and then people will invest. But it is important to not start late here, because you have constraints on labor, you have constraints on building that supplier sector. So I think get started and learn, but it has to be quite heavily subsidized to really ramp it up.
Right.
Some audience.
Yes, I'll come to you in a second. Thank you so much. I also, in a minute, if possible, would like to come to Bill Ayers in the chat, because you're offering a potted history of successive British governments' approach to this, and I'd love to hear that from you if we can. So, yes, and also I'd love to hear from you, Tracy, about skills and stuff, but since you had your hand up, let's come to you. Have you got a microphone?
There's several questions.
Okay.
She's first, I'm second, they're third.
Wait a minute. I thought I got to decide.
well, you haven't been watching.
Okay, so who wants to go first?
I'll jump in.
All right.
So I guess the panel's largely been talking about housing stock.
Sorry, what's your name?
My name's Becca. I'm an architect working in the city. And I run a practice. We mostly do kind of community-led development. So we've largely been talking about housing stock, but our clients are facing a massive VAT bill for doing the right thing. So the VAT on renovation in the UK is 20%, but for new build it's largely zero, which means that our clients are making choices to keep their buildings, their community buildings, their cultural buildings, their leisure buildings in community hands, and renovating them and making them work for the future have this massive bill that they can't always offset. Like businesses can often offset the VAT if they're not registered or if they're unable to kind of take on that burden of being VAT registered. So I guess it's, for me, that's one of the biggest kind of stops in the way of letting a revolution really start at that kind of community space outside of our housing stock. And I think there's still really important buildings that we need to save and not demolish outside of our housing stock.
And that was presumably unaddressed in the last budget?
Yes.
Any prospect of change?
There are a number of groups that I know are lobbying for it, but the change seems to be unlikely to happen anytime soon, which I think is a real failing. From a regulatory perspective.
Yeah, a really interesting point. Thank you. Are you holding a microphone? No. At the back, so the lady in red, and then down here at the front. Thanks.
I'm Professor Larissa Naylor, University of Glasgow, Geography. I'm going to turn this a little bit on its head and be a little bit more disruptive, hopefully. It was nice that the lady from the World Institute talked about adaptation and resilience. Are we retrofitting houses, buildings of any sort in places that they're not fit to be? In England, we have 8,000 houses at risk of coastal erosion. in 2018. That number is going to increase to 100,000 by 2100. That's just coastal erosion. That's not flooding, that's not wildfires, that's not buildings becoming too hot, living in parts of British Columbia, Canada, where I come from. How are we going to make sure that when we do this in climate resilient places, and we provide socially just means for people to transform and for society to transform? If you have 100,000 people trying to move, having to move because their house is falling into the sea in one tiny country, how do we get the neighboring villages that typically don't want change to accept these people and accept the building that will be required to house these people? How can we have that conversation and connect the dots so that we're really thinking transformatively, and this isn't just in isolation and building regulation across all of the gamut, and that we bring in insurers and we bring in kind of big transformative societal change to make sure that when we're doing this in the right places that are built to last?
Great question. 100,000 is obviously a big number. That's by the end of the century at current rates of coastal erosion, yeah?
In England alone.
But how big is it as a proportion of the total housing stock that needs retrofitting? I don't know the answer. Does anybody know?
It's about 21 million, we reckon, need some retrofit
Right.
homes.
Giles, that's not relevant. That's not...
It's because there's tons of there's tons of houses in climate ill resilient places. That's just the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
And so already in Miami, for example, you're having house prices drop at the seafront because they're not habitable, or they won't be. And it's not just at the coast. We have in floodplains. You have towns that have been scourged by wildfires. Should we rebuild them?
Yeah.
And so it's worldwide. There's going to be huge numbers of existing housing stock that is not fit to be. It's not climate resilient. You can make it energy efficient. You can make it net zero, but its location, its geography isn't appropriate. So how are we tackling the geographical dimension of where we're allowing these retrofits and who's making those decisions and who's doing that kind of analysis?
Great question. If anyone has an answer, do come back on that. But first, because I promised you, and you now have a microphone, please shoot.
My name is Donna Stimson. I'm a locally elected councillor, and all these problems that you've been talking about we face on a daily basis, but the skills are not there. The green skills are not there. So when the government puts in these proposals, we don't have the skills to do the retrofitting, to put in the ground source heat pumps or the air source heat pumps. We still have a lot of gas boiler fitters, and also we have a lot of social housing that is very leaky, and obviously we don't have the means to pay for it. So, I think there's a very exciting new industry out there, but the education is the thing that we need to do, and that also obviously applies in the south, in the southern hemisphere, where we really need to get to it in terms of that 139 trillion. I think quite a lot of it has to go towards how we house those people in the world in the right way. So that was my comment. But it's a question really in how we kickstart this revolution for homes. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, do we have another point there? I'd like to come back to the skills question. Yes, sir.
Hello. Hi. I'm also an architect.
And what's your name?
Enlai. Enlai from Smith Hammerlassen Architects in Denmark. From an architect's point of view, we're often dealing with developers rather than single homeowners. And I think that's part of the issue of renovation and retrofit, because we tend to deal with the larger projects. We tend to deal with the multi-residential or the commercial. And the thing that's tying or holding renovation back in most countries is the developer's view of risk, and also the engineer's view of risk. Because an engineer, for example, will not have any repercussions for demolishing a building and building new. They'll have no repercussions for over-specifying structure or over-specifying services, which is also an energy drain, especially in embodied energy, and in terms of services, in terms of operational energy. And the whole industry in its segmentation is educated and geared towards knocking buildings down and building new buildings. and there's no levers that or systems that allow you to insure buildings in the same way or avoid liability penalties in the same way if you try and do a good job and retrofit. So I'd like to see what the answers could be with regards to liability, insurance, and risk.
Thank you very much. Tracy, and please jump in if you want to respond to any of these many points. But you were saying when we were speaking earlier that in the UK, at any rate, there's a critical shortage of skills to seize this opportunity that Donna was talking about. How do we solve that?
Yeah, I mean, the infrastructure, it's just not there. I think the numbers I quoted earlier, I think we need to be doing to hit our targets around 500,000 ground heat source pump replacements a year, and we did about 40,000 last year. So we need to be training people, and whether that's governmentally or whether that's individual energy companies or whatever it may be, the gas boiler engineers will be needing to be retrained. We need the glazing fitters out there. We need the cavity wall or whatever insulations are appropriate for the walls, and we need these people now. So I think, as from a UK perspective, we should really be seeing this as an opportunity to put some jobs into the economy. That's what we need to be doing, because we can talk about it, we can get the investments going, we can get the consumer education going, but if we don't have the people that can physically go in and do these retrofits, we're not going to get to where we need to at the speed at which we need to.
Yes.
A comment on that. We grow almost every year, and we hire people every year. And what I see is that we have seen this artificial intelligence, AI, and then governments talk about what people do we need in the future. And if you sum it up, we have a shortage of digital people, we have a shortage of engineers, and then we have a whole lot of applicants that have studied in universities, in typically small cities where they have a university or education that is a copy of the famous Cambridge or Oxford or something. Loads of applicants. And then when we get to getting people on a building site, when we get to having people in the factory, even if the factories are getting more and more automated, there is no one going that way. So what I think needs to happen, if you look long term out and see that we're going to have to renovate and work and know how to do this work for the next 40 years, because it's a huge building stock. Once you put that in place, then you need to look at the education system and start to steer some of these white-collar education towards this job and pay for getting that work done. And those are local jobs, well paid, and you're going to have as much work as you want, rather than getting more people out in these kind of white-collar roles that are not needed. And this is a shift, and it's a shift that some governments don't want to discuss. Some have started to discuss it, but you need the work there. You don't need more quasi-academics in some places to do this.
Applause from the room there.
Sorry, I hope I don't get shot, because this is forbidden to...
Yes, Jennifer, and then I can see we've got some more people in the room, and we'll try and get to some more people in the chat as well.
Yeah, I actually want to go back a little bit, and I recognize how important the conversation is around jobs, so this is an incredibly important part of the conversation. But I do want to go back to the conversation we were just having about resiliency and adaptation, and where and how we think about buildings in the context of our economic development. Because I think there are three things that have happened. One, in the United States anyway, we are seeing the insurance industry being unwilling to insure, or premiums going up as much as 500% for areas in flood risk, in hurricane risk, and fire risk, if that is not already built into the insurance policies. That is incredibly burdensome, and it is a very difficult challenge then for people who are trying to be able to afford living in their homes. We have to manage for a transition, and that transition is not exclusively in the question, in sort of this space of people whose jobs have been lost because coal and gas transition is happening. It's because our economy is going to shift. It's going to shift dramatically. So I think that those kinds of increased costs, those kinds of increased programming to help and assist homeowners and businesses adapt to climate change. I mean, it's a clear discussion at the COP here, what constitutes loss and damage, what kinds of funding is going to be available, our government's going to step in, how do we create the social change that is required. And it's not just social change on the activist side, it's social change in terms of our economy and steering our economy. That's in skills training, that's in the way we think about zoning and planning. And it's also critically important in much of the world. We're working in Africa, and we have a couple of building efficiency and city-urban planning programs in the African context. We have 60% youth unemployment in Africa. And if you're looking for a way to think about a just transition in the context of many parts of the world, getting buildings right is a huge opportunity. But it does require that we think differently about what the role of government's going to be in thinking about the social network and the social fabric of the economy in order to make that change happen.
Can I just come back on the insurance point? Incredibly burdensome, you described it. Certainly, if you are living in a coastally eroded location where your premiums shoot up by 500%, I can see that. Is it not also an incredibly useful signal that this is real, that the private sector is responding in a rather brutal way, and that the public sector should therefore as well?
Right, well, I think the question is, how do you help with that recognition and that assistance? Because the person whose livelihood and whose home is connected to that community is going to feel a tremendous burden, a burden that they themselves didn't anticipate when their family built the home there 100 and whatever years ago. And so there is this need for a community-wide understanding of what are we going to do, how are we going to think about this, and what is the role then? Because that signal may or may not empower. It may be that there is little to do, right? There are a lot of people who can't afford to leave that home. They can't sell that home.
Yep.
They can't buy a new home. So what do? The social displacement of climate is going to be a significant destabilizing influence in our economy once we get to the higher levels that we're anticipating of climate change.
Thank you very much. There was a point on the right-hand side there, my right-hand side.
I represent, my name's Sarah, I represent the insulation, manual wool insulation manufacturers in the UK, including ROCKWOOL here today, but also chair a campaign called the Energy Efficiency Infrastructure Group. We're a broad church of over 25 organisations to basically develop a long-term plan for the energy efficiency of our buildings. We have a Better Buildings Investment Plan. One of the biggest issues here is the supply chain and the way that government policy works with that supply chain. Business needs certainty. They need to plan ahead. Pushing out subsidy into the marketplace so there becomes basically a boom and bust cycle is not healthy for this supply chain. What we need to do is actually focus subsidy on those who need it most, the fuel poor, the low income, and we need to actually focus the other mechanisms, 0% VAT, green stamp duty, the role of the UK Infrastructure Bank, the £16 billion green gilt, and other mechanisms to basically trigger this industry. It can be done. Government has to listen. But the trouble is government just has a policy, as with the Green Homes Grant, push it out there, saturate the market, and then bust. There were actually almost 1,000 jobs lost through the Green Homes Grant because of the way it was constructed and the short-termism approach.
Can you tell us a bit more about that fiasco? Because as a journalist, I'm dimly aware of it. I know I should know more about it, and it's my job to admit that and ask you, please, to tell that story.
First of all, I would like you to direct you to the EIG website. We did a sort of a complete dissection of the Green Homes Grant. I would like to say we don't like to focus on bad news. We want to look forward. But the Green Homes Grant basically was £2 billion pushed into the marketplace. We were not ready. It was badly constructed, badly run. But actually the industry did step up to the mark. But actually having a policy that lasts for 6 months not the way to go. So basically, people are still waiting for their money and for all the measures to be put into their buildings. But now, obviously, the Green Homes Grant has been cut. Literally, it was cut obviously overnight. So for the detail of that, please, I'd like you to go to our website to check the paper. But it needs to be a long-term policy. If the Green Homes Grant had been allowed to continue over 2 years, that would have been a very different story. There are a lot of installers that ramped up during that 6 months, and then they were cut off at the knees. If they're allowed to actually install the measures, we would be in a much better place today. It's the eig.co.uk.
Thank you very much. News you can use.
I have a short comment on that. And I think, first of all, the social unrest element, when it starts to go really wrong. We've seen it with the face masks for a while during Corona, where countries fight, and now we have the UK, France about the fish. It goes quick today, and it turns really nasty quickly. But what you said there, I think it's incredibly important to put a short goal and identify the constraints. So you have a 5-year goal, 10-year goal, but you said, let's put the 2-year goal now to figure out how it works here and identify the issues, and you evaluate it, but you create a long runway, and then you build it in steps. And the first ambitious part, where you miss a bit, you might not meet it, but you uncover all those rocks, you start to deal with it, and then you can train, you can build up the supply chain against it, because otherwise people exactly end up in that boom and bust cycle, and then politicians will use it afterwards. So it didn't work. We need to train the people more to understand. The people understand that it's nice to have a renovated home. It takes a second, but it's difficult to buy. How do you get the money? You get that in place, you can do it.
And importantly, just to build on that, if I may, once you've got a consistent demand coming through, that allows you to invest in the technology, and it allows the price to be driven down, and then the retrofit starts to become more affordable for more people.
And does that help solve the skills problem? We come back to the situation. I mean, you spoke about it. Everyone seemed to recognise it. We have a situation of a notional demand for new types of retrofitting and renovation, but not enough people who know how to do it. Is guaranteed demand sufficient to make this transition that Donna was pointing out needs to be made? Or is there an important government piece that's missing there?
So for me, I think having a consistent demand in there would encourage more people into that industry as a career, and or to transfer across. But we need to get the demand in, get the investment in the technologies, improve on the heat source pumps or whatever it may be, drive the unit cost of those items down, and then get them retrofitted into more homes more affordably. But the infrastructure issue persists. We still need to find people who want to work in those industries, who want to have those skills and come to market and be able to fill a niche. But in order to do that, we need to know how many of them we need. Mm-hmm. And so it is a little bit cyclical, and we need to, and I think that was the point the lady was making, we need to get that demand as consistent as we can, increasing of course, but as consistent as we can, so that we can start to build the infrastructure we need.
Okay, in a second, I want to invite all three of you to do, I'm going to be very irresponsible and do something you're not supposed to do, which is to ask you to name a silver bullet. We all know that this is a global problem, multifaceted, and the solution is and, it's not or, there's no such thing as a silver bullet. Nonetheless, I'm going to ask you for a silver bullet each to help kickstart the renovation revolution. But first, I did ask if Bill would be interested in giving us a potted history, a quick one, of British policy failures here. If we can go to Bill, that would be great. If not, maybe we can go to Claudia for a young landlord's perspective. Let's see if either of those two can join us online, from online. Doesn't matter if they can't. So I see a face behind the chat on my iPad, but I don't see anyone. Never mind.
Hello?
Hello?
Hello, sorry, but we just about to join a meeting, Giles. But my point about landlords was just, as someone who is a renter, and is probably going to be a renter for quite a long time, I hear a lot of conversation about as if it's like the consumer is the only person that can make a difference and has to be making these decisions about where they live and what the options that they have. But obviously, if you're a renter, that's kind of out of your control. And my experience of landlords making changes that are sometimes like necessary for health, damp, that kind of thing, hasn't been great. So I was really interested to find out what incentives there are for landlords to actually, improve homes that they don't live in, that they don't necessarily see the benefit of comfort or the benefit of lower bills. What can we do to encourage people to make decisions that impact them financially but benefit other people and benefit the world?
Thank you. Great question, and we might be able to persuade Tracy to offer an answer as part of your silver bullet. Who should we come to first for the silver bullet? Jennifer.
One silver bullet.
You can have
I was going to say, let me think about this. For me, it comes down to a couple of things. One, clear policy signals that are long-term and take into account the variety of needs in the market. UK, it sounds like, has specific needs. The second thing, and I'm sorry that we already covered it, finance. We really do need to have financial mechanisms that are linked to existing renovations. So rooftops fail, water heaters fail. The kind of appliances and equipment is you can get in and make that happen quite easily. And then the third thing that I would say we absolutely need is we do need to make sure that all new build focuses on ventilation, passive design, healthy design, and energy efficiency and embodied carbon. We didn't cover much about that, but we do need to make sure all of those things. New build is an opportunity. Retrofits is a separate opportunity and challenge, but we have to look at both of those.
Thank you. Tracy.
I would go for a bit of a suite of measures. I think probably for me, the most important one would be a maximum cost of retrofit to the customers. I appreciate that some are more able than others to afford it, so I do think that needs to be supplemented with grants, particularly for those that are fuel poor. But it has to be, the answer has to be consumer education, and for me it needs to be an incentive, so a carrot not a stick, so that people understand, nearly 50% of people don't know that their boiler contributes to climate change. We've got to get those messages out there. We've got to help customers understand, or consumers understand how they can retrofit their properties, where best to spend the money that's available, and I think a maximum cap, back to the gentleman we had at the start, £70,000-ish to be able to retrofit his property. It's just too much money for far too many people, and even with an average of 10,000, it's too much money for many, many families. So maximum ceiling on the total cost with a government support for the rest.
And what's your carrot for Claudia's landlord? Make it in his interests to make her life more comfortable.
So we need to be a little bit careful that we don't get some unintended consequences of this. So there have been some conversations around landlords must upgrade the EPC, so the energy performance certificate on the properties that are tenanted to a certain level. And for some tenants, their landlord may come in and they may do the retrofit and they may live in the property and it may be much more comfortable. But I'm sure there will be some situations where landlords feel the need to increase the rent as a result of that investment. And so we just need to be careful that it's a balance, and we're not just shifting the cost of that from the landlord to a tenant that can't afford it. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that anyone would necessarily just go out to do that. But you do have to think through these things quite carefully. So I think an incentive, but I think it needs to be a reasonable and responsible measure in terms of where that lands in the rental price.
Thank you. Jens, how do we kickstart the renovation revolution?
So silver bullets, I've said a lot of important things, but I think first, define deep renovation. I'm dead scared of that. We put money at something and then you raise the scaffolding all over the place and you do superficial work, and then you've destroyed the potential for the future, because we're going to learn. So define deep renovation. So when we erect the scaffolding around the house, we do it properly. And then the second, put some money to it and put a short-term goal. You have a long goal, but put a short-term goal so we learn. And then we do a focus effort on doing deep renovations, or learning how to identify the constraints, the skill gap, and then we build on that. So long goal, but most important, short, and the definition of deep renovation, and then get going this year, next year, and debug the process.
Thank you all very much. You know what? Before this, I thought that one elephant in the room would be that this was an unsexy subject and that we all had to find ways to get it into policymakers' minds and boost our own awareness. The opposite is clearly true. This has been the most sort of engaged and passionate audience of all the thinkings we've done here. It's clearly an issue that has deep personal resonance for everybody because we all live somewhere. So thank you very much for that. I've learned on a more specific note that we can turn to specific places for best practice. Jens mentioned the Italian example. We're not suggesting that that necessarily applies everywhere, but there are obviously lessons that we can learn from all over the world, not just trying to put expensive German huff houses all over the UK. And then three other general points. The one made at the back about the importance of an awareness of the general context, which is a climate emergency that is quite literally shrinking the land on which we can live. I do think it's fascinating to see how the insurance industry responds to that and how communities and governments may or may not step up to sort of insulate homeowners from that risk. The education piece, consumer awareness, obviously critical, but to Claudia's point towards the end, it is unfair to leave it only to consumers, especially if they're tenants, completely not in a position to afford a £10,000 or £70,000 retrofit, and that's where government comes in. And I think it's quite clear from the failure of the Green Grants proposal, am I calling it by the right name? That this government hasn't grasped the urgency or the scale of the task. We all know that post-COVID budgets are constrained, but we also all know that post-COVID growth is coming back. I do notice in the chat people saying we need alternatives to GDP as the only measure of sort of opportunity and success. Point taken. Nonetheless, I've learned a lot about the urgency of this particular problem and the solutions that really are out there. So thank you all again, Jennifer, Jens, Tracy, everyone in the room, everyone online, for a really great COP. Thank you.